The sky above the forest turned bright for a few seconds. Something small and burning raced through the clouds and crashed into the trees with a loud thump. Most people in the town didn't notice. They were sleeping. But one boy was awake. Jake, a 16-year-old who loved building gadgets in his garage, was working on a robot arm when he heard the sound. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't fireworks either. It was something different. Sharp, heavy, and close. He grabbed his flashlight and ran into the woods behind his house. The trees were dark and the wind was cold, but Jake didn't stop. After walking for 10 minutes, he found it. A small pod shaped like a round nut lay cracked open in the bushes. It was no bigger than a backpack, made of strange metal that shimmered in the moonlight. Smoke rose from its side. Inside the pod was something moving. Jake stepped closer and gasped. It was a tiny creature, no bigger than his hand. The small alien had soft blue skin, glowing eyes, and tiny arms that hugged her knees. Her hair was like silver threads, and she was wearing a tiny suit that looked half-burned from the crash. She was shaking. Jake didn't know what to say. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and then whispered, "Hello?" The alien looked up, eyes wide. She screamed in a high-pitched voice, covered her face, and curled up tighter. Jake didn't want to scare her. He slowly held out his hand, palm open. "It's okay," he said gently. "I won't hurt you." But the alien didn't understand English. All she saw was a giant human face looking down at her, teeth showing, voice booming like thunder. To her, he was a monster. She screamed again, louder this time. Jake didn't know what else to do. He gently picked her up and wrapped her in a soft cloth. She struggled, kicking and hitting, but her strength was weak. Her crash had drained her. He brought her back to the garage and carefully placed her inside a clean glass jar with holes in the lid. He added a small cloth for warmth and set it on the workbench. Zari, though Jake didn't know her name yet, sat in the corner of the jar, staring at him with wide, frightened eyes. Her hands were shaking, her heart was pounding. In her world, humans were spoken of in old stories, giant, scary, meat-eating creatures. She thought she had fallen into their world by mistake, and now she was their prisoner. Jake sat on a chair nearby, unsure of what to do next. He didn't want to keep her in a jar, but she was too small and scared. He got up and returned with a tiny piece of bread, a drop of honey, and a cap full of water. He placed them inside the jar, then stepped back. Zari didn't move. She stared at the food. Was this a trap? Was she going to be fattened up and eaten? Jake noticed her fear. He didn't speak, just smiled softly and pointed to the food, then to his mouth. He took a small bite of bread himself, showing her it was safe. But Zari turned away. She didn't trust him. Not yet. Later that night, Jake brought in a small lamp, dimmed it low, and set it beside the jar. He sat on the floor with a blanket, keeping a distance, hoping not to make her more afraid. Zari watched him from the corner. He wasn't acting like a monster. He wasn't growling or trying to hurt her. But fear is a strong feeling, and she couldn't forget the stories told on her home planet. As Jake slowly fell asleep, Zari finally crept closer to the bread. Her stomach was empty. She sniffed it, touched it, then pulled off the smallest piece. She tasted it. It was sweet. It was safe. She looked at the human again. He was curled up under his blanket, quiet and still. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't like the stories said. When the morning sun entered the garage, Jake opened his eyes slowly. He had fallen asleep on the floor next to the workbench, still wearing his hoodie and shoes. His back ached a little, but his mind quickly remembered the tiny guest he had brought home last night. He sat up fast and looked at the glass jar. She was still there. The small alien girl was awake too. She was sitting near the corner holding a crumb of bread in her hands. Jake smiled softly. She had eaten. That was a good sign. She noticed him watching. Her body froze again, and she dropped the crumb as if she had done something wrong. Jake gently raised his hand. Not fast, just enough to wave. "Good morning," he said quietly. Zari didn't understand the words, but the tone in his voice was soft. She didn't scream this time. She just stared at him with curious eyes. Jake didn't want her to feel like a prisoner. He found a small open box, placed a few pieces of cloth inside, and made a new little bed for her. Then he slowly opened the lid of the jar. Zari quickly stepped back, her eyes wide. She thought he was going to grab her again. But Jake didn't reach for her. Instead, he lifted the jar and gently tilted it toward the soft box. Then he stepped away. Zari waited. No sudden moves, no traps. After a few minutes, she carefully stepped out of the jar and into the box. Jake smiled again and whispered, "It's okay, see? You're free to move." He placed a few new items nearby, a bottle cap with fresh water, a piece of fruit, and a folded tissue that looked like a giant blanket to her. Zari didn't speak, but she looked at him for a long time, unsure what to believe. Later that afternoon, Jake came back with something new. He carried his old tablet and sat near the box. Zari watched as he turned it on. The bright screen lit up with images, pictures of Earth, the sky, trees, animals, and families. Jake pointed at each one as it appeared. "Tree," he said, showing a picture of a tall oak. "Bird," he said, pointing to a small bluebird. "Moon. House. Dog." Zari blinked. The pictures were interesting, and the sounds he made seemed to match the images. It wasn't her language, but she started to see the pattern. She stepped a little closer. Jake turned the screen toward her fully and showed pictures of stars, planets, and spaceships. He had downloaded them long ago from the internet. Zari gasped softly and pointed at one of the stars. Her eyes sparkled. She recognized it. Jake saw her reaction. "You know that one?" he asked. Zari nodded. She pointed again, then placed her hand on her chest. Then she pointed to the stars. Jake leaned forward. "You're from there?" Zari nodded again. Her hand touched her small chest again, and she said something in her own language. Jake didn't understand, but he could guess. It was her name. He placed his hand on his own chest and said, "Jake." Zari looked at him, confused at first, then repeated softly, "Jake." He laughed a little. "Close enough." Zari touched her chest again. "Zari," she said. Jake grinned. "Zari, that's your name." It was the first real connection between them, a name, a word shared between two beings from different worlds. That evening, Jake opened the garage window and let in the cool breeze. Zari sat in her box bed, covered in the soft tissue blanket, eating a piece of apple. She seemed calmer now. Jake didn't speak much. He didn't want to scare her again. He just sat near his workbench pretending to work on something, but secretly watching her from the corner of his eye. Zari looked around the garage, at the tools, the lights, the shelves, and the wires. It wasn't a scary place anymore. It looked like a workshop, a human safe corner of the world, a place where someone made things, not destroyed them. Before going to sleep, Jake placed a small flashlight near her bed, turned on to its lowest setting. It gave a soft glow. Zari stared at it for a while, then pulled the blanket closer and lay down. Jake whispered, "Good night, Zari." She didn't answer. But just before Jake turned off his light, he thought he saw her tiny hand raise slightly, like a small wave. That was enough. Over the next few days, something changed between Jake and Zari. She still didn't speak his language, and he didn't understand hers. But with small signs, soft voices, and patient looks, they started to understand each other a little more. Every day, Zari no longer hid from Jake. She explored his garage freely now. The floor was like a giant field to her. She walked carefully, stepping around screws, bits of paper, and old tools that were as big as trees to her. Jake cleared space on the workbench and even built her a small home out of a shoebox with tiny ladders made from popsicle sticks. Inside the box, he added pillows made of cotton and a small mirror. When Zari first saw her reflection, she jumped back in surprise. Then she leaned closer and touched the glass. She looked at her tiny face and smiled for the first time since arriving on Earth. Jake saw that smile. It made him smile too. One afternoon, Jake brought a small globe from his room. He placed it in front of Zari and spun it slowly. "This is Earth," he said. Zari watched it spin, tilting her head as it turned. Then she walked up and placed her hand on a blue part of the globe, the ocean. Jake pointed at the land and said, "This is where we are." Then he took his tablet again and opened an app that showed stars, planets, and galaxies. Zari stepped closer. Her eyes lit up when she saw a certain star system. She tapped on it with both hands and then drew a small circle on Jake's notepad. Jake looked at her sketch. It wasn't detailed, but it showed 2 suns and a planet in between. "You're from there?" he asked. Zari nodded. She pointed to the tablet, then to the stars, then to herself. Jake nodded. "I get it now. You're lost. You crash-landed here." Zari looked down, then slowly nodded. Her shoulders dropped. Jake could tell she missed her home. He wanted to help. He wanted to do something more than offer food and shelter. Later that day, Jake opened up his laptop and began researching. He looked for space signals, government satellites, and how to send messages into space. Most of it was hard to understand, but he didn't give up. Zari watched him from the side, her small face full of hope. That night, a soft rain began falling outside. The garage roof tapped with each drop. Jake and Zari sat quietly together. Jake showed her more photos. Animals, humans, families, celebrations. He wanted her to see what Earth was really like, beyond the scary stories she had heard. He showed her a picture of a dog. She tilted her head, curious. Then one of a baby laughing. Zari touched the screen gently. Then he showed a picture of people holding hands. Zari pointed at it, and then at him. Her eyes asked a silent question. "Friends?" Jake guessed. Zari didn't speak. She simply smiled and gave a soft nod. Later, while Jake worked on a tiny translator device using an old speaker and a voice chip, Zari explored the garage more. She found a box full of broken toy robots. She poked one, and it lit up with blinking eyes. She stepped back in surprise but giggled. Jake looked up. "You like that?" He walked over and gave her the smallest robot he had, just her size. It didn't work anymore, but Zari hugged it like a stuffed toy. She sat with it in her arms and looked around. This place, this human, this world, was not what she expected. She had always believed humans were dangerous, that they crushed anything smaller than them, that they only cared about themselves. But this boy named Jake had shown her kindness without asking for anything in return. She watched as he worked late into the night, trying to help her go home. No traps, no cages, no harm. Zari stood up, walked to the edge of the table, and raised her arm high. Jake looked up from his work and smiled. He raised his hand too. It wasn't a full conversation, but it was a beginning. Zari no longer believed. Humans were monsters. She had met one human, and he was something else entirely. The quiet days didn't last long. One morning, while Jake was having breakfast with his mom, the TV in the living room showed breaking news. The reporter spoke with serious eyes. A mysterious object fell from the sky earlier this week. Several people near the forest claim they saw lights and strange metal. The military is now involved in asking locals to report anything unusual. Jake froze. His spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. His mom looked at him. "You were in the woods that night, weren't you?" Yeah," Jake said, trying to sound normal. "I thought it was just thunder." His heart was beating fast. He quickly finished his food, rushed to the garage, and closed the door behind him. Zari was sitting in her small shoebox house, holding her tiny robot toy. She looked up and smiled, but Jake didn't smile back. He bent down to her and whispered, "We have a problem." He showed her the news on his tablet. Zari didn't understand the words, but she saw the picture of her escape pod. Her eyes widened. "They're looking for you," Jake said softly. "They might come here." Zari stepped back, her hands shaking again. She remembered the soldiers on her planet, big, armored, cold. She thought Earth soldiers would be the same. Jake put a finger to his lips. Shh, it's okay. I won't let anyone take you. He looked around the garage. Hiding her was now more important than ever. Jake found an old shoebox with a lid. He filled it with soft cotton and placed Zari inside. She looked scared but trusted him. She sat quietly as he gently closed the lid, leaving small air holes. Then he covered the box with clothes and tools to make it look like junk. A few hours later, someone knocked at the front door. Jake peered through the window. 2 men in dark uniforms stood outside. They had badges and earpieces. One held a picture of a strange round object. It was her pod. Jake opened the door, trying to stay calm. "Hello," the taller man said. "We're with the investigation team. We're asking if anyone in this area saw something fall from the sky a few nights ago." Jake shook his head. "No, sir. I didn't see anything." The other man looked around the yard. "Mind if we take a quick look? It's just a routine check." Jake's heart sank, but he forced a smile. "Sure, go ahead." They walked into the backyard and then toward the garage. Jake followed, trying not to look nervous. The men opened the garage door and stepped inside. One of them glanced at the workbench. "You like building stuff?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, just old projects." The other man looked around but didn't touch anything. Jake stood in front of the pile where Zari's box was hidden. He tried to act casual. After a few long minutes, the men gave each other a nod. "If you hear anything strange," the tall one said, "please call this number." Jake took the card and watched as they left. Waited until the sound of their car faded before rushing to the shoebox. He opened it gently. Zari was curled up, eyes wide. She looked up at him, her body tense. Jake gave a soft smile. "It's okay. They're gone." Zari slowly sat up and whispered a word in her language. He didn't know what it meant, but it sounded like thanks. That evening, Jake turned off all the lights and sat on the floor of the garage. Zari sat near him on a table edge. The air was quiet again, but their hearts were still heavy. Jake looked at her and said, "I think we need help. Someone who understands more than I do." He thought about Mrs. Nolan, his retired science teacher who used to talk about stars and satellites. People thought she was strange, but Jake trusted her. The next day, Jake placed Zari in a safe box and rode his bike to Mrs. Nolan's house, which was at the edge of town. He knocked, and the old woman opened the door with a curious smile. "Jake, what brings you here?" Jake looked around, then whispered, "I need to show you something, but you have to promise not to scream." Mrs. Nolan raised an eyebrow but nodded. Jake opened the box slowly. Zari peeked out, her eyes meeting the old woman's. Mrs. Nolan gasped but didn't scream. "My stars," she whispered. "You really found one?" Jake nodded. "Can you help her?" Mrs. Nolan leaned closer and smiled at Zari. "Of course," she said. "Let's get her home." Mrs. Nolan was not just a retired science teacher. She was once part of a private research team that had worked with satellites and space signals. She had old books, strange machines, and even a large telescope in her backyard that still worked. Jake had always thought she was a little strange, but now he was glad she was. Zari sat quietly in the box, looking around the room. Mrs. Nolan placed the box gently on a soft chair and leaned forward with kind eyes. "She's beautiful," the old woman whispered. "So small and so lost." "She wants to go home," Jake said. "Can we help her?" Mrs. Nolan smiled. "We can try." She walked over to her shelves and took out a dusty book. Then she turned on a computer that looked very old, but still worked. Jake helped her clean the table while Zari stepped out of the box and explored, slowly. She didn't feel scared here. The room was warm, the air soft, and the people kind. "Do you still have the piece of her pod?" Mrs. Nolan asked. Jake nodded and pulled it out of his backpack. A small part of Zari's escape pod that had broken off during the crash. Mrs. Nolan studied it carefully. "This is advanced, far beyond Earth's machines. But maybe we can connect it with my signal booster. If we're lucky, we might reach her people." They worked all afternoon. Jake fixed wires while Mrs. Nolan adjusted settings. Zari watched everything with wonder. Sometimes she pointed at symbols and made soft sounds, helping in her own way. But as the sun began to set, Mrs. Nolan looked serious. "We don't have much time," she said. "I heard on the radio that more search teams are coming. They believe something landed around here." Jake's heart sank. "They're getting close. We need to send the signal tonight," she said. Jake nodded. "Then let's do it." Zari looked at both of them. She didn't understand every word, but she understood the feeling. Time was short. She had to be brave. That night, under the stars, they placed the signal device outside near the big telescope. The dish turned slowly, facing the sky. Lights blinked. The machine hummed. Mrs. Nolan entered commands, and Jake placed the pod piece in the connection slot. Zari walked up to the device and touched it gently. She closed her eyes and whispered something in her language. A soft light blinked on the panel. The signal was sent. Far across the stars, a message raced into the darkness. Zari's people, if they were still searching, might finally hear her. Call Jake, watch the sky. I hope someone's listening. Suddenly, headlights appeared down the road. A black car stopped near the gate. Two people stepped out wearing dark suits. Jake's breath caught. "They found us." Mrs. Nolan quickly turned off the lights. "Take her. Use the back path through the woods. I'll stall them." "But go now, Jake. Save her." Jake grabbed the box and gently placed Zari inside. She was scared, but she nodded. She trusted him. He ran through the side door and slipped into the trees. The woods were dark, but he knew the way. He had walked this path many times before. Behind him, voices shouted. Lights flickered, but he kept moving. Zari peeked from the box. The leaves above looked like green skies. The wind touched her skin, and she held onto the edge. She saw Jake running for her, protecting her, risking everything. She whispered his name. "Jake." He didn't hear it, but he kept going. After nearly 20 minutes of running, they reached an old wooden shed deep in the forest. Jake had once used it to hide toys and tools. He placed the box down gently and sat beside it, breathing hard. Zari climbed out and looked up at him. Her eyes were soft, full of emotion. "You're safe," he whispered. She walked forward and touched his hand. Jake looked down. Her tiny fingers rested on his thumb. She wasn't just some alien anymore. She was his friend. Far above them, stars began to move. Zari looked up and smiled. Something, or someone, was coming. The night was calm but full of quiet tension. Jake and Zari sat inside the old wooden shed, listening carefully. Every little sound, rustling leaves, distant animals, felt important. They both knew something was coming. Mrs. Nolan had stayed behind to distract the searchers. Jake hoped her plan worked. Zari sat on Jake's knee, her small hands wrapped around his thumb. She looked up at the sky through a crack in the shed's roof. The stars twinkled above like bright jewels, far, away, and mysterious. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, a sound unlike anything Jake had ever heard. Outside, the sky opened like a curtain. A sleek, silver ship hovered silently just above the treetops. Lights from the ship danced over the leaves. It was Zari's rescue. Jake's heart raced. He stood quickly, holding Zari close. The ship's hatch opened slowly, and a tall figure stepped out. The figure's skin was pale blue, and their eyes sparkled like stars. It was another alien, larger than Zari, but with the same soft features. The alien spoke softly in a voice that sounded like music. Zari looked at the visitor and smiled. She whispered words in her language. Jake didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. "They heard me." The alien nodded and turned to Jake. "You have saved her," the alien said. "For that, we thank you." Jake felt proud but also nervous. "I just wanted to help." The alien stepped closer. "Your kindness is rare. It shines brighter than your stars." Jake blushed. "Thank you." Zari looked up at the sky again and then back at Jake. She held his hand tightly. The alien turned back to the ship and called softly. A smaller pod descended and landed beside the shed. Zari's eyes grew wide. It was time to go home. Before stepping into the pod, Zari reached into a small pouch and took out a tiny glowing pendant. She gave it to Jake. "This is for you," she said with a smile, "a symbol of friendship between our worlds." Jake took the pendant carefully. It felt warm and alive in his hand. Zari hugged him one last time. Her arms were small but full of gratitude. The pod's door closed gently and the ship lifted silently into the sky. It disappeared among the stars, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves behind. Jake stood alone in the dark forest, holding the pendant. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "Goodbye, Zari." After the silver ship disappeared into the night sky, Jake stood alone in the quiet forest. The glowing pendant hung softly around his neck, pulsing with a gentle warmth. It was a small thing, but it meant more than words could say. He looked up at the stars, feeling both happy and a little lonely. Zari was gone, back to her home among those distant lights. But she had left a part of her here, a promise of friendship that crossed the vast space between worlds. Days passed. Life in town went back to normal. The military search teams left, and the strange stories about the falling object became just rumors. But Jake never forgot. He kept the pendant close. It was a reminder that kindness and trust could change even the biggest fears. One evening, as Jake sat on his porch watching the sunset, he saw a small light flicker in the sky. It was far away but bright. He smiled. Maybe one day Zari or her people would come back, not as strangers but as friends. Back on her home planet, Zari told her people the truth about Earth. She spoke of Jake, the human boy who had saved her, fed her, and helped her send a message to the stars. She told them how humans were not monsters but protectors, how one human had shown courage and kindness unlike anything she had known. Her words spread quickly through her people's hearts. The leaders of her world decided to open a new path, a path of peace and friendship with Earth. For Zari, the journey had begun with fear and ended with hope. She had learned that even the smallest light can shine brightly in the darkness, and that sometimes the biggest monsters we imagine are just people waiting to become friends.